Welcome to another episode of The Dissection. Today was an interesting day in Zimbabwe because we've seen the effects of factional battles within the ZANU-PF political party and the public appetite for those political contestations for power. On the one side are those within the Mnangagwa faction, which is basically the ruling faction in Zimbabwe right now, who want the status quo to continue. And on the other side are those who are opposed to what is known as Agenda 2030, which is an attempt to give a third term of leadership to Emmerson Mnangagwa, who will be 85 years old when the next election happens in Zimbabwe in 2028. So today there was this massive call for protests, and we will discuss whether that massive call for protests was successful, but it's important for me to give you some backstory so that you understand the context in which we got to this particular point. Earlier this year in February, a journalist known as Blessed Mnangagwa, who is a journalist with Newsday and Heart and Soul Television, which are well-consumed publications and I think digital platforms in Zimbabwe, was arrested. And he has been in custody since the 24th of February. And he's been in custody and was arrested over accusations of incitement. This arrest happened as a result of interviews that he had, which garnered lots of attention in Zimbabwe. What interviews, you may ask? Well, basically, this journalist, Blessed Mnangagwa, had an interview or series of interviews with an 80-year-old war veteran and politician who's known as Blessed Geza. These interviews occurred in November last year and in January of 2025. In those two interviews, Blessed Geza said that he would mobilize the public to protest and to push for the ejection or the stepping down of President Emmerson Mnangagwa, for him to step out of office. The reasons for these protests, according to Blessed Geza, were the following. He cited corruption, mistreatment of soldiers, economic issues, and what he broadly referred to as the president's failure to govern, the president of Zimbabwe's failure to govern. So I've talked about Blessed Mnangagwa and Blessed Geza. I just want to say something. Zimbabwean names are the subject of discourse and merriment on the internet for this reason. Someone can be named Passport. Someone can be named Airport. Someone can be named Sweetheart, Evidence, Promise, or Blessed. So Blessed Geza is this guy's real name. That's his real name. He didn't call himself that after taking a nice bath, which he felt was anointed by the Spirit. He's just named Blessed Geza. So this war veteran, Blessed Geza, is the source of the commotion as things stand right now. The protests were meant to happen today. But what happened mostly is not that people went out into the streets in high numbers or large numbers, is that people did what is known as a stay away. A stay away is a form of protest where instead of going onto the streets in high numbers and risking being beaten up by the police, arrested, etc., people just stay in their homes, they don't move, and they show that they're not willing to participate in business as usual and send a message to the political regime that way. It's not as dramatic as a protest, but it is understood by the establishment also to be something which shows that while we are not going to support or participate in this form of activity, we are not going to actually endorse your request to continue with business as usual. It is an asterisk which says that the people are displeased with the state of affairs and displeased with the direction of the country. But it's not as dramatic. So it's a muted response, but it's a response nonetheless, because what could have happened is that people could have just gone about their day-to-day business, which is what the government was calling for. There were some protesters who were recorded later in the day, after about 12 p.m., 1 p.m., and you could see that the numbers were not large as far as nationwide protests go, as far as what we could really consider to be a significant protest. So in terms of protest turnout, the numbers were relatively low, but there were some people who protested in various parts of Harare. The Zimbabwean police and other instruments of enforcement were actually also in full force. So prior to all of this happening, the political regime sent out its messages, sent out its apparatus, and let people know that we're not going to have it, we're not going to tolerate any protest. And that also in and of itself typically has a chilling effect, because the Zimbabwean military apparatus and the police regime can be particularly violent. They do have a record of having killed protesters, of having made people disappear. There are people who are still being searched for right now, where nobody can ascertain what exactly happened to them as a result of their political activism. So this is where things stand right now. But I think it's important to address the concerns which exist around the president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, as things stand right now. And these concerns, they stem from various sections. You've got civil society, the public, you've got the military, the war veterans, and these concerns arise out of different incentives and motives. But these are the concerns. The first concern is that of dynasty. People are concerned whether the Mnangagwa family is creating a dynasty. Soon after the Zimbabwean elections in 2023, Emmerson Mnangagwa put several of his family members into critical positions of influence. He appointed his then 34-year-old son, David Kudakwashe Mnangagwa, as the deputy finance minister. He appointed his nephew, Tongai Mnangagwa, as the deputy tourism minister. His other son, Sean Mnangagwa, is a major in the army and was promoted to that role in 2022. Sean Mnangagwa is a member of the Presidential Guard. There are other relatives who have been appointed in various positions. There are other members of his clan who have been appointed in various positions. So the concern around family dynasty is one that arises as a result of these appointments. The thinking and the curiosity and the question is, are these appointments preparation for these family members to take over the ZANU-PF party, to take over the rule of Zimbabwe in the foreseeable future? One of the issues which led to the fall of Robert Mugabe was that he seemed to be preparing Grace Mugabe, who you may famously know for having tried to beat up that young lady in a hotel in Sandton, but who also had a reputation for spending the limited resources of the Zimbabwean coffers on fancy clothes, trips overseas, and a variety of things. Her sons used to be in Sandton partying it up, driving lavish cars all over the place. So at some point, Grace Mugabe seemed to be positioning herself to be the next leader of ZANU-PF and the next president of Zimbabwe. And that was something that was not palatable to the military apparatus. And the military has a large say in Zimbabwean politics. Typically, they operate behind the scenes, but they are a large factor within ZANU-PF politics. And ZANU-PF has been governing Zimbabwe in various formations since 1980. So basically, this is the 45th year of ZANU-PF military rule in Zimbabwe. So that was the first concern. And the concern around dynasty, around Mnangagwa. And the discussion about Grace Mugabe is just a point that those concerns seem similar to the concerns about Grace Mugabe, the concerns about the Mnangagwa sons in particular. The second concern is about Agenda 2030. This concern is about whether Emmerson Mnangagwa has any ambitions to stay in power beyond the second term. In 2013, prior to 2013, basically there were no term limits, which is what allowed Robert Mugabe to continue governing Zimbabwe and treating it like his personal property. Zimbabwe was basically a dictatorship, and there were a few moments where there were elections, and those elections would happen in a very unfree and unfair environment. But there were opportunities that existed where, even in those hostile conditions, the MDC party actually prevailed. In 2008, Morgan Tsvangirai won the first round of elections. People say he actually won it outright in terms of that he got over the 50% threshold, but then the results got cooked. And then there was a whole movie there, and then he was eventually forced to get into a government of national unity, a GNU, if you have been following the popularity of that term in South African politics. But it was not a fruitful GNU. He left it shortly thereafter. And it was a poisoned GNU because that GNU was manipulated as a result of ZANU-PF actually refusing to leave power and refusing to hand over power to another political party. So there were pushes for reforms after that, pushes for reforms, which then led to a change in the Constitution of Zimbabwe. And in 2013, Robert Mugabe signed a new constitution into law which limited presidents to 2 5-year terms. And that constitutional provision did not apply retroactively. So Mugabe would have been able to stay in power for a further 10 years if it had not been for the 2017 coup, which actually then limited his stay in power to 4 more years after he signed that particular term. So what does the Constitution say? In section 91.2, it says the following. A person is disqualified for election as president or appointment as vice president if he or she has already held office as president under this constitution for 2 terms, whether continuous or not, and for the purpose of this subsection, 3 or more years service is deemed to be a full term. So if you've been in office for 3 or more years, it's a full term. 2 terms, you're out. You can't come back as vice president. You can't come through another door. That was the design to try to prevent a Mugabeism, if you will, in future. So Mnangagwa's second term and final term as president it expires basically in 2028. He's in his second term, and there are going to be elections in 2028. But there have been people who've been pushing for a third term and a change of the constitution in something which is known as Agenda 2030. They say that they want to see President Emmerson Mnangagwa in power to foresee the Zimbabwe Agenda 2030. He cannot be in power by 2030 because the constitution prohibits him. So there are people who are now mooting the idea that the constitution should be changed to accommodate that. The idea of Zimbabwe scrapping term limits was actually discussed at a ZANU-PF conference last October. And the ZANU-PF party has taken a position that they do want to extend term limits for President Emmerson Mnangagwa. However, there are some within the party who are not happy with this, which is why we are seeing the developments that we're seeing right now. There was a discussion between an information operative from ZANU-PF and Zimbabwe with Newsroom Africa, and you can hear from his answer to this question that there is a determination to continue with the amendment of the constitution. Just listen to this exchange.
Zimbabwe's constitution is very clear as to the term limits of the president. Are there plans to change that?
First and foremost, the constitution was written by people, and the constitution has got avenues and channels and guidelines on how any issue about it can be amended. There is no issue on the constitution which is cast in stone, except issues maybe which relate to universal human rights. But be that as it may, as ZANU-PF at our conference last year in October, yes, we resolved that we're going to seek a legal way for the president to extend his term. The president has said that he is not willing, but as ZANU-PF, this resolution stands. So in the face of that, no one outside of a legal channel can prevent the legal seeking of a solution. If people are so certain that this is an unpopular opinion and this is an unpopular design, then the constitution provides the legal channels through which this can succeed. If those legal channels do not succeed, they should not succeed on legal terms and on the legal requirements given by the constitution, not on anarchy, not on someone believing that because they as individuals have a certain belief, they must ride it roughshod over everyone else.
Yeah.
We are a liberation movement. We are not shaken easily, and we are not scared easily either.
Listening to this gentleman from ZANU-PF, it appears that there is a plan in motion to change the constitution and to pave the way for a third term for Emmerson Mnangagwa. There are challenges, however, that I want to point out to changing the constitution because it requires 2 specific amendments. So I just read to you what section 91.2 says, that you can't run for 2 terms. But there's also another section, section 328, and this is what it says about amendments to the Constitution in and of itself. It says that any amendment is considered to be a constitutional bill. Then it says the following about a constitutional bill in section 328.5. A constitutional bill must be passed at its last reading in the National Assembly and the Senate by the affirmative vote of 2/3 of the membership of each house. In section 328.7, it says, notwithstanding any other provision of this section, an amendment to a term limit provision the effect of which is to extend the length of time that a person may hold or occupy any public office, does not apply in relation to any person who held or occupied that office or equivalent office at any time before the amendment. So what that means effectively is, if you amend the Constitution to extend the term limits for the president, that will not benefit the person who held or occupied that office at any time before the amendment. So before you can actually amend the term limit, you have to amend Section 328.7 to change that particular provision, which requires 2/3 of the membership of each house to vote for. Then you have to change Section 91.2, which says that somebody is disqualified if they've served 2 terms. So this whole constitutional battle is at its early stages. They will have to go through the legal process, like the gentleman said. They do have an appetite to do it, but there's likely to be pushback from the public. It may very well be that some of this is an early trial run by different rivals within ZANU-PF around this issue of the term limits and how to oppose Agenda 2030. We've seen sometimes in Zimbabwe that protests happen and they are not necessarily organic. They are protests which have been sanctioned by particular elements within the intelligence, within the military, etc., to test or to push certain things, right? So this could be what's happening with this particular situation. To be fair, to be balanced, Emmerson Mnangagwa has said that he will not seek a 3rd term. This is what he had to say.
Besides being a soldier, I'm a trained lawyer. I'm a constitutionalist. I want our party, our leadership, our people to be constitutionalists. We must abide by the provisions of our constitution to the letter. Kana nguva yekuti uinde inda, inoinda.
Do I believe Emmerson Mnangagwa? From where I'm sitting, I do not believe this man. I don't believe him for any second, for any iota of any sentence that he has uttered. I have zero belief in any statement that comes out of his mouth. Why am I saying this? Firstly, Emmerson Mnangagwa has a reputation for being a crocodile. That's his reputation. That's his nickname, crocodile. And the very nature of the crocodile is that it seeks to calm your fears. It seeks to bring you into the water, to lure you, whether you're a zebra, whether you are a gazelle, or just a child there by the river. You just look at the waters and you see this log floating harmlessly, lifelessly in the river. And if you are taken in by that, you will get comfortable. You will lose your vigilance. And before you, whoop, it's got you. Leaps at rocket speed to pierce your lungs and to tumble dry you in the muddy bed of the river. One of the worst deaths possible. You're drowning. There are crocodile jaws in your chest. And you don't even know what's fully happening. The adrenaline is kicking in. The water is gushing through your nose. These are the effects of a crocodile. It is, by design, one of the animals that seeks to pacify, to lull before it leaps into action and you become its meal. Having said that, I would not trust anybody who's with a reputation like that. I would never trust anybody with a reputation like that. I would never. And I think it would be foolish to do so. In 2017, when the first coup happened, many people embraced that coup. And they said, wow, this is wonderful. They supported the army. The South African media went and covered that event. And they were also very supportive of what is happening. And I pushed back. I called some of my journalist friends. I made videos, even on Facebook. And I said, why is everybody acting like this is not Emmerson Mnangagwa? Somebody who was on the right-hand side of Robert Mugabe since 1970, God knows what. He was with him side by side. He was tutored. He was mentored by Mugabe. So Mugabe can only produce Mugabe. And I said that, this was merely a snake shedding its skin to get a fresh skin, and that the ZANU-PF regime would continue with the same levels of brutality, the same levels of corruption. People said I was a naysayer, I was a wet blanket. But I just looked at the fact on the ground, and I was like, why would anybody assume anything different? So I never bought in. And at that time, there was an attempt to even say, it's not a coup. No, this is not a coup. This is a civilian. I said, no. It's a coup. It's very clear. The military is involved. The military is all over this thing, and they are using all of these sequences of events to usher in Emmerson Mnangagwa. So I never backed that. And I think I've been proven to have been right. Right? I've been proven to have been right. Something that deep down inside you don't want to be right. You want to be wrong. You want there to be a dispensation of democracy and prosperity for Zimbabwe, but it cannot happen under ZANU-PF and under Emmerson Mnangagwa, and it has not happened under them. What I'm trying to say is that even now, even as I listen to Emmerson Mnangagwa, I cannot take anything he says as sacrosanct or truthful because he has a reputation. And some of the promises that he made when he was, orchestrating this coup have never materialized, and they were never going to. The second thing that makes me skeptical, and this is more substantive outside of the track record of Emmerson Mnangagwa, is that the words of the ZANU-PF representative, the resolutions of ZANU-PF at the conference last year, the appointments of various family members to cabinet positions, all of these are indicative of a family that wants to stay in power for the foreseeable future and is paving a way to be able to do that. It's likely that they are trying to keep alive two options. Option one, a third term for President Emmerson Mnangagwa. And if that fails, option two, one of the family members then campaigning as leader of the ZANU-PF and contesting in the 2028 election, As things stand, that is what seems to be happening here. And this is what seems to have caused some disgruntlement within the military ranks and within the war veteran ranks, because there are other people, possibly Chiwengwa, who want to have a clear path to the presidency and do not want to have a situation where one of the Mnangagwa family members takes over, or where there is a third term. As things stand, everything that has materialized in the last few months is not a populist movement. It is not something that is coming from civilians. It's not something that is coming from politicians who are recognized within the Zimbabwean ecosystem, although there is a lot of discourse around the collapse of opposition in Zimbabwe and the co-opting of opposition in Zimbabwe by ZANU-PF, because you may know that the CCC party, which was led by Nelson Chamisa, a variety of shenanigans played out just after the elections, which have led basically to Chamisa being in the political wilderness, have led to another guy saying, Tendai Biti saying that he's retired from politics, another guy, Wolfman Mube, emerging as one of the orchestrators of the collapse of CCC. And it may very well be that the next election will have different political formations on the opposition benches, but the opposition in Zimbabwe right now is in disarray and is very weak, even though they have a presence in the benches of parliament. A lot of times you'll hear them clapping for ZANU-PF and Emmerson Mnangagwa, which is just a bizarre thing. But it seems as if they have been co-opted and they have been bought with, perks in parliament and a variety of things. It's a discussion in and of itself. And I think I did make a small video, but it does need a longer discussion just around the state of opposition in Zimbabwe. But as things stand right now, all of these developments are as a result of an internal dispute between members of the ZANU-PF, between different factions of the war veterans. It has nothing to do with civilians. It is a power struggle within the ZANU-PF. Power and political influence in Zimbabwe at this particular moment lie within the security cluster, the defense forces, the police, the intelligence operatives. Those are the power brokers. The senior leaders of all of those entities have long history and status and influence within the ZANU-PF. They are the movers and shakers of the ZANU-PF. This is a ZANU-PF thing. It is not a civilian thing. It is not a public thing. So whoever prevails in this particular dispute, in this particular moment, it will not necessarily be an advancement to democratic rule in Zimbabwe. And in fact, right now, I was listening to the ANC talking about Zimbabwe and talking about sanctions and all of that. And it just appeared to me that they don't have an appreciation of who the bad guys are in Zimbabwe and what the real issues are in Zimbabwe and really what a progressive liberation movement should be standing for or whose side they should be on at this particular moment in Zimbabwe. It seems as if the ANC now is on the side of those who are accused of committing a genocide in Zimbabwe, whilst going to the ICJ to hold accountable an entity that they're accusing of committing a genocide. It's a contradiction. But that's where things stand right now. And that's the situation. If something materializes further, I may make another episode. But as things stand right now, it looks as if this was some kind of a show that there is resistance to Agenda 2030, but it was not a critical turning point in Zimbabwean political history. The people stayed at home, which is in and of itself a message, but there were some protests, some scatters of protests, which is in and of itself some kind of show that there is a willingness to protest. But because the political situation is discombobulated within the opposition benches, there's nothing much that's likely to happen that is going to really create any traction or any different movement at this particular point in 2025. We'll keep you updated if something happens. Let me know what you think in the comments. We can have a conversation. Have you been following this? Are you interested in any of these developments? What's your view about the crisis in Zimbabwe and how to achieve it? Let's have a conversation. Till the next one.